Hello, welcome to News Desk. I'm Ami and Isif.
I'm Stacey Bivitz, and it's great to have you with us for our final episode of the season.
It's the final episode of the season. We're going to go on a break after that. We have just... we've been going for 8 episodes now.
Yes.
Some of you guys are coming back to us. It's been great. We've had a lot of people in the chat returning. I've recognized some names.
Yes, some of you guys are very prolific in writing in, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
So a lot of you already know the drill. We take a news topic every week, something that's making headlines, and we try to go as deep as possible with experts, but we want you guys to help ask them questions.
That's right. You guys are central to the show, so write us, send us your questions and your comments, and we'll put them forth to our experts.
Yeah, and this week we're looking at Ukraine's announcement of perhaps the long-awaited counteroffensive against Russia in the south. That would be the area around Kherson. We're going to look at the significance of that. We're going to look at why the government announced it on Monday, but then has been very tight-lipped about what is actually going on there. So we want to get to the bottom of what this offensive could look like, what it could mean. Is this a significant turning point in the strategy that Ukraine is using against Russia in its... because the war has turned essentially into a stalemate, and Ukraine is trying to break through that before it loses momentum, before Western interest in the conflict and support for Ukraine possibly fades out. So we're going to be looking at that. And speaking of the government's tight-lipped stance toward this, let's hear what President Zelensky said about the counteroffensive in the south.
Sure, you all understand what is happening and what we are fighting for and what we want. Our soldiers don't need any announcements or information leaks. Ukraine is reclaiming its own, and it will reclaim Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and the Kherson regions, Crimea, and definitely the waters of the Black and Azov Seas.
Tough talk there from the president.
Right. That's a long list of what he says Ukraine will take back, not giving a timeline there. But what we're focusing on is the Kherson region, because that is what most people say is the focus of the counteroffensive in the south. And what's interesting there is he says, you guys know what's happening. We don't need any announcements or information waves. So kind of warning journalists to not pry too much into the details of what's happening there.
Yeah, but I also feel like it's a little bit of, I don't know, like gamesmanship on his part too, to let the West, who is supporting Ukraine militarily, like financially, that it's worth the effort, it's worth the investment, and then letting Russia know that they're putting on a fight. Because it seems like you mentioned a stalemate, it seems like that's definitely the case in the east, and now Russia is sending its troops to the south where this offensive is happening. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of gamesmanship there.
Yeah, signals that there is a reorganization of the focus of where the fighting is happening. And of course, we have very little information of what's happening on the ground. There's a lot of videos circulating that we haven't been able to verify just yet, but we're going to have experts on to talk about this with us. Our first guest is going to be Nick Connolly. You might remember him from the last episode. He's one of our Ukraine correspondents, has spent the majority of the war in the country reporting for us, but he's in Berlin right now, so we're lucky to have him on the show. Then we're also going to be talking to Frank Ledwidge. He's a military analyst at Portsmouth University, and he's going to really get into the details. So if you guys have questions about the tactics, about strategy, and of course about how the weapons could be a turning point, or have been a turning point, and maybe one of the reasons why Ukraine is announcing this long-awaited push in the south, then you can save those questions for him. And also we're going to focus in the second half about another key region in the south, and that is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because the UN is sending a delegation of investigators to the plant to get a picture of what's happening there. If you've been following the headlines, there's been some alarm about the safety of that plant. It's the first time we've had a war in a country that has nuclear power plants, and a lot of experts are warning that obviously this could be a serious situation for the region and for the world at large if there is a nuclear accident.
Because it's the largest power plant in Europe. It's in the middle of a war zone, essentially. And while this is all happening, it's still up and running. So there's 10,000 Ukrainian employees at the plant working under Russian guard. So, yeah, it's... pretty important right now.
In the International Atomic Energy Agency, yes, an International Atomic Energy Agency, which is associated with the UN, has sent a delegation there. They're in Kiev now, but they're trying to make their way to the plant. Of course, there's fighting around there. So they want to get a picture for themselves of what's going on there. And of course, there's fighting from both sides. Russia occupies the plant now. So a very serious situation. We're going to have on a guest that has been on DW before, Elena Sokova. She's the director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She's a nuclear security analyst. So she's going to be on in the second half of the show.
And to help us peel back the layers of this very tricky situation, we have our news desk team here. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
We have Hannah Kossigan, our
Hi, guys.
a deputy editor. We have Felix Fiedler, our tech guy. Hi, Felix. And with us here, we have the desk reporter, Dustin Hemmerlein.
Hello, everybody.
It's nice to have you with us. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat already and questions, but there was somebody who had a question that I'm particularly interested in, and I wound up losing it. So it's a good thing that you gave me this copy.
The printed version, the backup.
Printed version. Let's see, where is it? I just lost myself. Okay, here it is. It's from Aero HK, and they say, I'm a bit confused about the power plant. Who is shelling the plant? If it's Russia, why are they shelling their own base? And if it's Ukraine, can't they just stop? I think that these are fair questions from Aero HK.
Yeah, and I do get Arrow's confusion here, right? Like, it's a confusing situation. But first, I want to say the Zaporizhzhia power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, not the largest power plant at all.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm also the fact checker of the show, so I need to kind of swoop in
correct.
there. And
no fake fact gets
exactly.
passed.
I mean, I hope. So yeah, I get his confusion, right? Like, it basically the question is like, why does not everyone just stop firing on the nuclear power plant, and then we wouldn't have that issue of like a possible nuclear disaster in a war zone? And basically, what's happening is Ukraine is saying that Russia is making the power plant a target by putting military forces inside the plant. And if we pull up a map of the plant, I think we have one ready, where you can see the front lines and the plant. Oh, yeah.
I'm going to go with this one first just because it's easier to show where the power plant actually is. It's this little rectangle that's split in half with a white top and the red bottom here. But I'll switch to the front lines one after that. But just so that everybody knows, this is where the power plant is on the Dnipro River.
Yes, and the Dnipro River is what I want to talk about next. And the power plant basically is on the south of the Dnipro River. That's where Russia has its forces, and on the north of the Dnipro River in this region is where Ukraine has its forces. So basically both sides are shooting at each other from the other side of the river, trying to hit the other forces. It's mostly artillery fire, and that's what the danger lies to the plant. And Ukraine is saying Russia is putting military targets inside the plant, thereby making it a military target. And what Russia is saying is that Ukraine is shelling the plant and thereby causing a possible nuclear disaster. So, and it's difficult. We don't really know what's happening, but there is a UN-affiliated team heading to the plant. And after they arrive, we might get more information. We might be able to actually say who is in the right here, who is doing what at the plant. At the moment, it's just super difficult to know who's right. Interesting fact about the plant, though, it's still being maintained by Ukrainian workers. It's just Russian soldiers controlling who are controlling the plant, but still it's Ukrainian workers from that city next to it who are still working there and doing the day-to-day work.
It's really interesting.
And so the UN investigators are going in to see if everything is secure and how the employees are being treated, because there were some reports of abuses there and even people that are missing. Is that right?
Exactly. So there's all kinds of information coming from there. And the UN committee is mainly there to find out, is the plant safe? And what can we expect? Obviously, everyone wants to avoid a nuclear disaster. But on the other hand, Ukraine needs energy, and the plant is delivering around 1/5 of the electric energy that Ukraine is using. So they really needed to be online. That's the Ukrainian side of things.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the south and the push for the south as well, because that power plant is providing energy for areas south of the Dnipro River, which is currently occupied by Russian troops. So really a battle over a source of energy that focuses on the power plant, which itself has become a target, putting the whole region in danger of some kind of nuclear accident. So we're going to obviously ask our expert what the risk is there, too. I think it's made a lot of people in Europe wary, people who remember Chernobyl. That was before I was born, but that is something that makes everybody nervous. That was the worst nuclear disaster in history. And
yeah, people have a memory there of what happened. And so,
So guys, if you're interested in this, stick with us. We'll have an expert coming on later. It's the second expert in the show. So that person will be able to answer all the questions on the power plant.
And I have a question for you guys. It's the poll. And the question is, what is your primary reason for following events in Ukraine? A, I'm interested in military strategy. B, I'm worried about my own safety. C, I want a just outcome. Or D, other. And so if you have a different concern, please write that in and let us know what that is.
Yeah, I have already taken the poll.
And what did you vote?
I can't tell you yet. I'll tell you once the results come in.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, and so this announcement on Monday, that's the headline right now.
Yes.
That they have, one of the announcements was that they've broken through some of the points along the front line in the war against Russia in the south. That is to be distinguished from the east, where a lot of the fighting had been previously concentrated. And a lot of this focuses on Kherson. So that is a city that was the first to fall to Russian occupiers. It would be a significant gain for Ukraine if they could get it back. But this brings up so many questions. Is this really happening? Is this the push that Zelensky has been talking about for weeks now? Is this the right time to do it? Can they do it? Do they have the manpower? Do they have the weapons that they need to accomplish this? And what exactly are they trying to do? Now, obviously, with the government being so tight-lipped about their strategy, this is going to be very difficult to find out. But we do have some clues about what would be their method to go about regaining some kind of ground. And look, the Ukrainian government has warned that this is going to be very slow. And we want to talk about that with our correspondent, Nick Connolly. If he can come in now for us.
We have Nick here.
You might remember him from the last episode, as I already said. He actually, the last time I saw you was when we were in Ukraine together, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was quite some
When
time
was
ago.
it? That was at the end of May? I went twice, and I think we saw each other the second time. I can't remember.
It's been a while, definitely.
Yeah.
But you can't get rid of me here in the studio.
We're glad to have you. So
Desperate to get on.
Well, we're glad to have you for our last episode. And this is a topic that's really important to our viewers to get a picture of what's really happening in Ukraine, which is a bit difficult from this far away. But I want to talk to you about this announcement and how it's come through the media. Hannah, if you can pull up those articles, because we've had a lot of people already in the chat say, yeah, I would believe it if I hadn't already heard it 5 times, and it never happened. So I just want to pull this up. Ukraine battle expands as Kiev launches counteroffensive. That's from May 28th or 29th, I think.
29th.
29th, right. So the same headline, but months ago. If you can show the next one.
I just want to say this one is also specifically about Kherson. So this was back in May. It says launched a counteroffensive on Sunday in Kherson. So that was, several weeks ago.
Right, they're talking about
months ago.
It's not just, I mean, the counteroffensive can describe anything that would be a pushback against Russian forces, but we're talking here specifically about the area around Kherson.
Yeah.
Can you go to the next one?
Yeah.
Right, Kherson, Ukraine stepping up counteroffensive to retake city. According to sources, this one is from July.
You want the third one?
Yeah.
That's good.
And Ukraine's long-awaited southern counteroffensive begins with a bang in Crimea. So if you guys remember from a couple of weeks back, this was earlier in August. So what are we talking about here, Nick? What is happening? Is this the long-awaited counteroffensive that Ukraine has been talking about for some time now?
I think that's a very brave commentator who kind of jumps on that and tries to give a conclusive answer. It does seem like there's more happening than in previous times. I think if you look at some of those articles we saw there, that was about basically stabilizing the front lines between Kherson and Mykolaiv, which is the biggest and closest kind of Ukrainian-held city in the vicinity, a city that has been bombarded daily for months now. People might remember pictures of the kind of destroyed government building there, where the governor kind of survived by turning up to work late. And basically, it seemed to be at the time that it was just about making sure the front lines were kind of far away enough from the city to make it kind of pleasant and kind of pleasant, maybe a big word, but somehow realistic for people to stay there. Because right at the beginning of the war, people were just kind of running in huge numbers, and it looked like the city was basically going to be kind of given up. So it does seem, based on what we've seen on social media today, that a lot more is happening. So we've seen the Ukrainians bit by bit attacking Russian weapons depots, trying to basically use the American supplied weapons, those rocket artillery systems, HIMARS, that have the ability to hit targets 60, 70 kilometers away, further than what the Russians have in terms of equivalent systems, to destroy weapons depots, basically try and deprive the Russian forces of their huge superiority in weapons. Because, if you remember just kind of early summer, basically the Ukrainians were being outgunned. They just didn't have a chance. The Russians didn't really need a strategy. They were just throwing so much in the way of shells at soldiers that...
Around the area of Kherson.
Everywhere. They have these huge supplies of Soviet-era artillery shells, bullets, everything, the whole kind of gamut of the kind of lower tech equipment they had. And so they didn't really need much of a strategy, and they didn't need much in the way of high-tech weapon systems. They could just throw so much at the Ukrainians trying to defend what territory that they still controlled. So now this was about basically depriving the Russians of that superiority to give the Ukrainians a chance to start kind of using superior tactics, using more complicated...
What does that mean, deprive the Russians of that superiority? Are you talking about the fact that they've gotten bigger weapons?
Not necessarily, not bigger, but just more. They just have, I went to see a commander on the front lines between Kherson and Mykolaiv who was saying basically he was having to plan every time he used shells. There were times where he could hit Russian targets, but he's having to think 3 times, when is the next delivery of shells coming? Do we even have enough of these Soviet caliber shells to carry on fighting for weeks at a time? Are we maybe going to end up in a situation where we don't have anything to fire anymore? We've got the tanks, we've got the systems, but we're just there with kind of empty boxes. And that was basically the system, the situation up till a couple of weeks ago. And now it seems like Ukraine has really hit those Russian targets really effectively, to a situation where basically the Russians don't have as much to throw at them. And even today we've seen even more attacks on Russian weapons depots, attacks on bridges, basically trying to catch the Russians on that west bank of the Dnipro River and to make sure reinforcements from the other side don't come in.
So basically what you're saying is what could make this different, these headlines about an offensive and a counteroffensive in the south, is the weapons that have come in from the west that have made Ukraine confident in trying to regain territory, hit targets further across the front line, and that's why this would be different from these headlines that we saw in May from New York Times, for example.
Exactly. So, I mean, basically what this has done, it's allowed Ukraine to kind of even the playing field a bit and to basically make Russia work harder and, prevent Russia from using that huge superiority, that huge kind of basically pile of weapons they had that basically prevented the Ukrainians really from making any progress, because as it was just basically too dangerous for Ukraine to send large numbers of soldiers towards the Russian positions, because they just were going to be, torn to pieces, and the losses would be just too high. So that seems to be the difference. And we've definitely seen in terms of the kind of activity today, obviously these are all videos we can't verify, but, some sources, bloggers that have proved more or less to be reliable, are showing lots of what looks to be explosions in Kherson and surroundings today. And obviously this comes off the back of the attacks in Crimea, which is where all the supplies going to Kherson would be coming from. So it does seem like this is a bit different.
So there does seem to be a bit of momentum then on the Ukrainian side, but Nene is not convinced. He says, or they say, to think Ukraine stands a chance against to regain territory against Russia is delusional. Is that, do you think? What do you think? I mean, I know you don't want to prognosticate too much. But.
No, but I mean, I think, obviously there are big challenges, and it's a lot more difficult to take territory back than to defend, right? There's all these, there's the kind of calculation that you need 3 times more, or you need to have 3 times more forces or kind of potential in an area than the defenders to regain territory or to take territory. And it's not clear. Obviously the Ukrainian army isn't telling us what exactly they have in terms of resources in that part of the front lines. But this is a part of Ukraine where Russia has fewer forces at their disposal. They focus most of their energies in the east. So this is an area where Ukraine, in theory, does have the chance to kind of throw more at the Russians. Also, it's important to look at the map and to see that Kherson is basically the only bit of territory west of the Dnipro River that Russia controls. And having destroyed or very seriously damaged all the bridges coming across, it makes it a lot harder for Russia to resupply those troops and to really support that effort against Ukraine. So this could be a kind of small and realistic win for Ukraine, because it is so limited, just that western bank of the Dnipro River.
Maybe we could zoom in a little bit on the map. I just want to point out that you can kind of see the blue water come in up to the top left, but that's not the Dnipro River, right? You have this other part that's underneath that thick red line. There's another body of water, and that is kind of the dividing line for a lot of Ukraine, but Russia has actually gained territory above that.
Exactly. So you can see kind of where the reservoir, that kind of light blue kind of sausage kind of going through that red territory there, and that continues obviously flows past Kherson out to the Black Sea. So that is the kind of most obvious first step for this Ukrainian offensive, to try and push Russia back to the other side of the river. Obviously, that doesn't do a lot for Kherson, because I was talking to people in Kherson over the last few months. It's obviously not been easy to report on life there, but people do have access to messengers and can talk on safe messengers platforms, and they're all convinced that if Russia is pushed back, they're just going to be under extraordinary artillery fire. But basically, the Russians would stay on the other side of the river within distance of artillery fire, and actually, in a way, the situation could actually get worse for the people still in Kherson if Russia loses control but stays within artillery range.
Well, so Kherson is key because it's helping with the supply route. So if Russia has sustained a lot of loss of personnel and machinery, Bjorn Jensen wants to know, can Russia endure to lose the same number of personnel and machinery in the next 6 months as they've already done?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? But we are seeing that Russia is really struggling to recruit people for this war. They've been going to prisons, seemingly. That Wagner group, those Russian mercenaries, are now recruiting in prisons, offering people their freedom in return for, and obviously very high wages in return for a willingness to go fight. It seems like lots of the poorer regions of Russia that were the kind of main places that people were signing up for in the early stages of this war, that's kind of plateauing now. There basically aren't that many more people willing, even for huge salaries by Russian rural standards, and people being offered kind of 4,000 or 5,000 euros a month salary, which for places where the average wage is going to be close to 300-400 is a big deal.
It's huge.
But given the losses and all the bodies coming back from Ukraine, I think it's increasingly difficult for Russia to recruit, and we've actually having reports of people in the big cities who previously had been kind of left alone by the Russian government now being called up by the military authorities, to go find out if they are even in a state to fight, if they are physically fit enough. And that's obviously really got people worried, because I think for people in the kind of big cities of European Russia, for them they could kind of ignore this for the first few months of this war. Yes, there were some kind of turbulences with the currency. McDonald's left, they couldn't order. IKEA left. Lots of kind of consumer goods went, and they couldn't fly to Europe, but they weren't being asked to fight, and now it looks like they might soon actually have to go fight.
And what about the Ukrainian side? Because I know that people that I've talked to in Ukraine, young men, were eager to sign up to fight, but back in May when I was there, they weren't allowed to because they didn't have training. But it looks like Ukraine is trying to recruit more people now. They've expanded the military as well, but these new recruits don't have as much training. So maybe you could talk about their struggles as well to have enough personnel to create this kind of situation for a counterattack.
I mean, obviously,
Nick, 1 second before you answer, I have to say the chat is saying you're talking very fast, and
okay,
I know it's exciting being on the show, but
I will.
need to slow down a little bit.
I've had too much of our wonderful machine coffee, so I'll slow down a bit. As for Ukraine, I think it's easier to recruit people because obviously the motivation is clear. These are people who are seeing this war on their doorstep. They're seeing the consequences of this war, and so far Ukraine hasn't had a problem. They've actually, at the beginning of the war, had the opposite problem. They had huge queues of people outside the military commissariats wanting to sign up, and sending people away who were too young or too old or too unfit. So I think they're not having to really go and kind of grab people off the streets to find enough people. The training issue is definitely a thing. We've seen people now being sent for training to the UK. There are plans to do the same thing in other European countries to provide them with basic military training. But I think for now, up till now, this really hasn't been a problem for Ukraine. The bigger problem was the weaponry, and even more than the weaponry, just the bullets, the ammunition. They sometimes had lots of Soviet weapons, but just nothing to shoot with. And now, after months of regular deliveries from the West, it's still not like Ukraine is reaching parity with Russia, but by clever tactics and some high-tech solutions that the Russians don't have access to, and the Russians aren't able to copy because of sanctions, and they're not being allowed to buy chips and other kind of components that would really allow them, in terms of drones and other systems, to take the fight to Ukraine. Ukraine is now in a better position and is not kind of struggling so much to kind of keep Russia in check.
When you talk about keeping Russia in check, maybe you can expand a little bit more upon this. Anoras Bruzas says, given Ukrainian counteroffensive is as successful as most of us hope, how will those destroyed bridges affect their own future movements?
That's obviously an issue. Yeah, I mean, if they want to take the fight to the Russians east of the Dnipro River, I guess the only kind of obvious, I'm not a military expert, but it is true that Ukraine controls a lot of territory on the east bank of the Dnipro River further north, so maybe they would have to come from there around Zaporizhzhia. I think
have a look at the map just to give people an idea of what I think this commentator, what was his name again? He's a step ahead of us. He already has the strategy figured out. Essentially, Ukrainian troops are trying to destroy bridges and the supply line for Russian troops along the Dnipro River, right? If you could just get a tight zoom on Kherson there. And so his question is, if they destroy those bridges, then once they take that territory back, will that affect their own strategy? Yeah, you could zoom in a little bit further, a little bit south too.
I mean, this is a huge river. I mean, this is a river that even in Kiev, hundreds of miles further north, this is more than a kilometre wide. There are islands in it. This is not a kind of puddle like the Spree in Berlin.
Yeah.
So this is a real serious task in terms of kind of recreating this infrastructure. The Russians have already been building pontoons because of that damage to the existing bridges. That's not going to be an easy task to kind of repair that. But I think for now it's about pushing the Russians out of that western kind of stronghold west of the Dnipro River. And then, if they were to be successful, then they could come from the north where they control both sides of the river.
And this points to a larger question, too, because it's not just about pontoon bridges and military infrastructure, but Ukraine is essentially trying to take back a city, Kherson, that has Ukrainians living in it. So it's a battle over a city full of people that Ukraine is fighting for instead of fighting against. So whereas Russia was able to bomb Mariupol into submission, Ukraine obviously is not going to drop as hopefully going to reconsider if they have the opportunity to drop bombs directly onto Kherson, and that is a handicap in war.
Definitely, and that's something that the Ukrainian military complains about, or wants people to talk about, the fact that there is that kind of asymmetric kind of that disbalance there, that they are having to wage a more careful war and be more selective. Now, coming back to those HIMARS and other kind of systems sent by the West, Germany recently announced that it would be sending artillery shells with GPS that allow the military to really focus on very specific targets and to avoid the kind of casualties we've seen, especially with Russia using very old missiles. Some of the missiles that Russia's been using are from the 1960s, 70s, were actually built to attack ships, but they're being used to attack targets on land. So they're really notoriously ineffective and unable to really focus on targets. And we've seen residential buildings and shopping centres being hit, even when they were kind of hundreds of meters away from the intended target.
Attacks.
Or they're just not good enough. Sometimes they work out, sometimes less so. It's obviously always unclear what the kind of intended target was, but definitely there are lots of question marks there over Russia's ability, even if it wants to really focus targets and to kind of protect civilians.
We have actually some video from Kherson from earlier in the war, just to give people an idea of what the situation looks like in the city. Just a quick view of the destruction that's been caused in that city, because we don't want to play. You've mentioned these videos circulating on Telegram, Nick, of the current counteroffensive or alleged videos of the counteroffensive. We don't want to play those before we verified them. Unfortunately, we don't have video so far of this counteroffensive, but we want to give just an impression of Kherson.
Exactly. Let me just show you what the destruction in this city, what destruction in this war can look like. Hannah, if you don't mind pulling up the mall as it was before. Oh, there we go. This is the mall in Kherson, what it looked like before it was hit by an attack. And then we have a Twitter video that we can show, a tweet we can show of what the mall looked like after. And yeah, I just want to give you guys an impression on what the destruction looks like. And I always feel like when we talk tactics about these cities, if they were captured or not, right? Like, this is what happens there. Like, actual buildings are destroyed and burn out like this.
Somehow I find that absolutely haunting to see an image on Google maps, Google Earth. It's happened a lot since the Ukraine war broke out, where you're trying to find a street or what is in this area, and you look and you're getting a picture of what the country looked like before the war. So you can also like walk around Mariupol on Google Earth and see what the city looked like before it was bombed. And something very haunting about that to me, the idea that just a year ago Ukrainians were going about their daily life, a lot of them unsuspecting of what was going to happen this year.
And often not really wanting to believe that it was possible.
Right.
I was in the kind of Ukraine's far east on the border with Russia just a couple of weeks before the war started. And we were in a village that was surrounded by the Russian border on three sides. And basically there was just a fence, nothing more. And we were asking them, you know about this Russian troop build-up. What's your kind of game plan? What are you going to do if something happens? And people just refused to talk to us about it. They wanted to talk about the fact that their village shop was going to close. The owner of the village shop had announced that he was going to close his kind of little food shop in like 2 months, and they wanted us to report about that. And you would ask people, and I think
because they're upset about it.
I mean, obviously it was upsetting. It would make their life more difficult because they would lose their kind of last kind of immunity in their village. But I think partly, it's a kind of psychological self-protection process that, if you feel so vulnerable, and unlike me, the journalist, you don't have the resources to get out, you don't have a car waiting, you don't have a flat somewhere else to go to, you just block it out. And I think lots of people, had kind of convinced themselves that after 8 years of this kind of medium low intensity war in the East, things were going to stay that way. And, all the kind of Russian troop build-ups, people just wanted to file it away as brinkmanship, as political theatre, and they just didn't want to go there. They just didn't want to believe it could happen again.
And you were in Mykolaiv after the Russian invasion on February 24th. That was the city that we saw that's across the river from Kherson, so really on that southern front line. What was your impression there? How did people feel about being that close to the first occupied Russian city? Yeah,
it was really strange. You could have a pizza, you could have a latte, you could buy a kind of some replacement stuff for your smartphone, but equally, lots of people in uniforms, lots of signs of destruction, endless air raid sirens at the time. That I was there kind of in June. It was a slightly calmer period for Mykolaiv. It's got a lot worse since. People ignoring most of the air raid signals, just kind of determined just to kind of have some life and go out and not just kind of sit in their cellars in fear. But since then, it's been pretty grim. I mean, it's kind of alongside Kharkiv, I'd say it's kind of the big major Ukrainian city that gets the most shelling. And basically, most of my mornings start with news of 1, 2, 3, 4 people being killed in just another shelling attack. This is a very low-tech war in this part of the country because the front lines are so close. They don't need cruise missiles. This is just artillery shelling.
Can you explain the difference between that? Because in Kiev you get the air raid sirens, but a lot of times nothing happens or the missile is shot down. Just explain the difference between the long-range missiles and shelling.
I mean, the thing is, from Mykolaiv to the kind of front lines, at least when I was last there, it was about, I think at the closest point, about 20, 30 kilometers. And so that's in range of, shelling of, these are very cheap weapons, of which there are many. And the time it takes from, that shelling going out to hitting its target is very, very short. So, your chances of getting an air raid signal in time or some kind of alert are pretty slim. Whereas obviously now, Kiev is hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines of fighting, albeit the Belarusian border is only about 100 kilometers direct line away, and we've seen missiles being fired at Ukraine from Belarus. We've seen planes going up in Belarus and missiles being fired from them. But for the most part, stuff being directed towards Kiev and places west comes from a long way away. So there's a chance for the Ukrainian radar to pick it up and to give those warnings. But the problem is, basically, you can't really tell specifically where it's going to go while it's still far away. So as a kind of precaution, they send everyone into the bomb raid shelters. They put on the kind of alerts across the country, which then means that you obviously have lots of kind of false alarms, which then encourages people to go and ignore it. So it's a very difficult and very kind of low-tech situation where also some of these cruise missiles can actually be redirected while they're already in the air.
Oh, wow.
So they might have been targeted one place as a kind of decoy, but then they can be moved. So it is a very imprecise science, and it's one that basically has left most people in Kiev for the most part ignoring it and just trying to go about their lives. At most, sometimes people go in their bathrooms. You try to have 2 walls between yourself and the outside, so you have your outside wall, then the bathroom wall, and that's where we are right now.
Last week, we were talking about how sometimes people wait too late to leave, and it complicates the fighting for, the Ukraine military. So Patrick Smithsons wants to know, how is the local Ukrainian resistance impacting Russian ability to hold Kherson and other territories? Is there a significant partisan presence?
Well, that's, again, something that's very difficult to quantify. We have, from the beginning, if you remember, when the Russians went in, there were actually demonstrations against the Russian forces. Some pretty extraordinary scenes of people with kind of Ukrainian flags and posters basically standing outside, next to tanks or, shouting at Russian soldiers.
Yeah, I remember.
And that was seemingly quite big numbers of people coming out for the first couple of weeks, months, and then you heard of arrests of activists and intimidation. Basically, the Russians didn't want those images, and they were able to kind of make them a thing of the past pretty soon. But we have seen posters and kind of more anonymous things, people showing kind of Ukrainian sentiments on the streets of Kherson. And now in the last few days, we've seen more attempts to take the lives, especially of Ukrainian former politicians or officials who have been cooperating with the Russians. So just in the last few days, we had the report of the death of someone who had been a member of parliament in Ukraine's parliament from President Zelensky's party. He's a big local businessman who had gone to collaborate with the Russian authorities. There'd been an attempt on his life when he was in his car. That failed. And now it seems he was killed in his home. That seems to be confirmed now. Pictures
by partisans.
That's the Ukrainian reading of it, that these are partisans. We've had similar news of attacks on people kind of further down the food chain, local officials who have cooperated with the Russians. I think the definitely Ukrainian narrative is that basically in 2014, in Crimea and in Donbass, basically these people got away with it. Ukraine was not in a state to kind of make people think it was too much of a risk to basically, ignore their Ukrainian affiliations, to ignore that, oath they'd given to the Ukrainian government. And I think now the focus is basically to try and spread some fear, to make people think twice before they go ahead and get a job in, these newly created Russian occupation authorities.
So Anthony Hinskin? Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. He wants to know, do these car bombings in Moscow and in Russia-held territory increase the risk of Putin escalating his tactics in Ukraine? And then he adds the use of nuclear and chemical weapons.
I mean, short of nuclear and chemical weapons, it's kind of hard to see how he can escalate, right? What has he not done yet? I mean, we've seen cruise missiles attacking civilian infrastructure hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines. We've seen repeated, attacks on transport infrastructure, people trying to get out, civilians being killed. Kramatorsk, the train station, you might remember those pictures. As for the nuclear side, well, what security analysts talk about, they imagine that behind the scenes there's a lot of kind of communication going on between the United States, between NATO and Russia, and basically trying to make it clear to the Russian side that that is just not an option that the West will tolerate. We can't know if these conversations are happening, but we haven't seen any real activity on the Russian side that would actually suggest that they are seriously putting their nuclear forces on alert, making it more likely that they would use those weapons. As for the attack in Moscow, well, there are lots of question marks. This was pretty fresh last week when we spoke. We've just got more confusion basically since then, and lots of theories whirling around about whether this was actually people within Russia doing this, some kind of internal Russian power struggle. There have been more versions released by the Russian security services, seemingly or apparently implicating Ukrainian security, but none of it really stacks up in an obvious way, at least based on what they've released so far. I think it's difficult. I think the chances that there's going to be a further escalation because of this kind of thing, I think, are unlikely. I think the bigger risk of an escalation is if Russia really starts losing ground, losing territory, and that threat to Vladimir Putin's prestige at home. If he feels like he's in a corner and about to to face a rout in Ukraine, then maybe Russia would actually be willing to kind of up the pressure and take bigger risks.
So before we go to our next guest, I have another question for you. It's from Jacob Randall. He wants to know, what do you think about the timing of the offensive? Do you think that the U.S.'s November election is causing Washington's urgency to Kiev to initiate this attack? Well, I mean, there's no proof that the U.S. is pushing Kiev to do this attack right now, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, and if there was such pressure, we wouldn't hear about it, right?
Right.
I think we've had more the sense of the opposite, that Ukraine has been asking for more weapons, been asking for those weapon supplies to be accelerated, and the flow of weapons is significant, and it definitely is on a level totally unthinkable when you think about back to the beginning of the war, when Ukraine was basically getting the kind of weapons that the US had given the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s, kind of light stuff, the Stinger missiles that you can basically don't need any training, and you can hit a helicopter kind of on the run. And now Ukraine is getting high-tech weapons, getting high-tech kind of state-of-the-art drones, is getting these kind of rocket artillery systems. I think one important thing is just the weather, right? So in a couple of months' time, it's going to be autumn, it's going to be wet, moving large numbers of troops across wet territory, often in armored vehicles along bad roads, is very, very difficult. So I think there's really the pressure on Zelensky now to try and get some kind of win for his own people, to show Ukrainians what they've achieved in half a year of war.
And you've mentioned what role the weapons are playing in this campaign. You've mentioned why Kherson is such a valuable city to Ukraine, and also what the larger strategy is here. But we want to bring in our next guest, Frank Ledwidge, who's a military analyst. He is a senior lecturer in military strategy at Portsmouth University. He's also a visiting fellow at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center. That's in Kiev. So he told me when I talked to him earlier that he just got back from Ukraine. So welcome back. I guess you're back in the UK now, in a little bit safer zone. We want to play this, what we heard Zelensky say earlier, and then we can talk about what he's actually saying here.
I'm sure you all understand what is happening and what we are fighting for and what we want. Our soldiers don't need any announcements or information leaks. Ukraine is reclaiming its own, and it will reclaim Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and the Kherson regions, Crimea, and definitely the waters of the Black and Azov Seas.
So this was Zelensky's way of addressing the push in the south, but he's being very vague here. What is he saying, do you think?
A lot of the reasoning behind this Nick's already covered. It's also worth remembering, you had a look before at where Kherson is, and the Russians, the only foothold they have on that right bank of the Dnieper River. It's also, don't forget, that's the last step remaining that in Russian possession that threatens Odessa. So once the Ukrainians retake Kherson, which I think they will in the next, it's not going to be next week, but it'll be in the medium term, and certainly before something, I mean, Nick already mentioned or hinted at what's called the Rasputitsa, which is the autumn time. I'll come back to that. But anyway, Kherson is the last remaining foothold the Russians have that could possibly threaten Odessa. When the Ukrainians retake Kherson, I think the threat to Odessa will be removed. So there's that, and that's absolutely the basic objective. The number one objective is to remove those Russian forces from that right bank. But then, of course, once you do that, and again, all that's hinted at, we're talking at the strategic level now, assuming they can do that over the next however many weeks, because I think what they'll be doing is what's called a bite and hold technique, and we've seen that a little bit. The Russians using that, including today, by the way, in the southeast. So they won't be taking huge areas, be taking village after village, 100 meters here, a kilometer there, until they get to the outskirts of the city. But once they do threaten Kherson and they achieve some sort of settlement there, what that also does, and this was hinted again by Nick and yourselves at the start of the program, is that by implication threatens Crimea. And that is a real threat to Russian strategy. So Kherson is absolutely critical. It offers a defensive barrier in the shape of the Dnieper River, but also a poise or a threat or a potential shaping for the next step forward into Crimea, should they get the equipment, training and brigades to do that. So that's the sort of grand strategic shape.
And what is
concerning the timing?
What is your impression here, though? Is this a turn in tactics? Is this a big shift in what Ukraine has been doing? Do you expect to see what the media has been calling a long-awaited counteroffensive in the south, or are we talking more about a subtle shift in tactics here?
It's been flagged for a long time, as everyone knows. It's the first major counteroffensive we've seen. We've seen other counteroffensives, though, don't forget, in Kharkiv. Back in, I think it was around May, yes, early May, Ukrainians retook a good chunk of land after their major victory around Kiev and indeed Kharkiv. They retook a chunk around Kiev and essentially opened not so much a safe zone, but a sort of cordon sanitaire around Kharkiv in May. So it's not really it's not a sea change. What it is, it's a long promised, and Zelensky hinted at that, a long promised counteroffensive to retake Kherson. We've all known it's coming. One thing which I was not expecting, but I wouldn't be surprised yet to see, is another strike somewhere else. And I'm talking here a little bit further to the east, because diversions happen. I'm not saying this is a diversion. Well, to the east of Crimea. So down there towards Berdyansk, perhaps, that's on the coast, or even Mariupol. But I don't think we're going to see that. It was something I think that was possible until quite recently. We may yet do that. We may yet see that, because let's not forget as well that the Russian lines are seriously stretched along that whole southern coast area. You have a much diminished Russian force, although they have brought in reinforcements recently. The British intelligence reported that they've been bringing in the units from the Eastern Military District, which have been for a long time. The 35th Combined Arms Army now is standing on the defensive, according to the Brits, around that sort of Kherson Oblast region. So we don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if there would be another strike somewhere else south of Zaporizhzhia, but I'm not sure the Ukrainians have the force for that yet.
Frank,
it will happen at some point, but not yet. It
seems like timing is more of an issue for Ukraine than it is for Russia, just because of the weather and maybe the influence of the West or support of the West might wane. What is going on, though, with the Russian military? Even if they're fine having a protracted war, they're having problems getting people to sign up to fight. And to counterbalance this, they've lifted the age requirement for fighting. As Nick mentioned, they are recruiting out of prisons. Just what is happening with this Russian military, and did they get everything wrong?
Yes, from the top to the bottom. This was a misconceived invasion from the start. It was poorly planned, as everyone knows. The soldiers weren't even told what they were doing. There was no element of joint command, as between the services or indeed between the operational areas. That was only united under General Dvornikov in, I think it was in April or May, who was subsequently fired anyway. There's a lot of concern, according to Western intelligence, within the Russian armed forces as to whether their command and control arrangements are even going to work. Which is to say, when you bring an Eastern military area army across into which is, by the way, we're talking Siberia, Vladivostok, that's where it's based, and you bring that into a combat area, how does that command and control system work? No one quite knows that. But that's on the negative side of the Russian ledger. Let's not forget that from the Russian perspective, they're quite happy to stand now on the defensive for the duration. They realise it's highly unlikely in the foreseeable future that they're going to be taking the rest of the south coast. They're still nibbling away in Donetsk Oblast, and Kharkov is still under threat. But essentially, they're digging in now on the defensive until next year. We won't be seeing any further major Russian offences until then. So look, they're happy to stand on the defensive. There's another tranche of conscripts coming in October. They'll get a few thousand of those to volunteer, I would suspect, but we're looking towards the end of the year. So all they're doing is they're consolidating. They've announced an increase in the number of the armed forces. Russia's always had a problem with recruitment in its conflicts, be it Chechnya, or the 2 or 3 Chechnya conflicts, be it Syria and elsewhere. So we can expect these issues. The problem for the Ukrainians, of course, and you hinted at it already, is that they are very worried about their war sinking down the news schedule and boredom setting in. And of course, the overriding issue now of at the grand strategic level of energy costs and what effect that'll have on Germany, on Europe, on the United States as well. So Ukraine needs to get some success quickly, as Nick already hinted and yourself did.
Okay. We have a couple of questions for you from the chat. Let's see. Enoras Bruzas asks, if Russians are pushed away from Kherson, how will this affect battle for the eastern part? More focused Russian forces and harder, or demotivated enemy and easier?
Even today, Russia has struck south from Izium, which is a forgotten zone in the. It's actually, I think, it's in Donetsk Oblast. They've made some progress. They're still attacking there, and they will continue to do that until they've taken Donetsk. They've already taken Luhansk Oblast, and that's a very local fight. I don't think we're going to see major offensives there. What we'll see is the nibbling away at territory. I don't think they'll get further than Slavyansk and Kramatorsk there. I think the Ukrainians will hold them there. But anyway, look, that's getting into the woods of it. But to answer the question directly, if they lose Kherson, I think the Russians will be not content to lose Kherson, but I think they are going to lose Kherson. In what shape Kherson is in after the Ukrainians take it's a different matter. Perhaps we can come on to that. But to come back to the question, the Russians will stand on the defensive and wait things out. I don't think they will be conducting any more major offensive activities until early next year, or perhaps into next year. They're going to stand on the defensive, where they then have something of the advantage, I would suspect, because Ukraine will need to amass much greater forces to be able to dent Russian defences. And let's not forget as well, and I don't like to say this, but it has to be said, that this is a dynamic war. The Ukrainians have learned a great deal. They're a far better force than they were at the start of the war, but so are the Russians. They learn too.
Okay, wow. So Alvin Schum also has a question. And there was talk about a referendum in Kherson, and he's saying, does the referendum in Kherson by Russian authorities play an impact on the timing?
I would just say, just for context, the referendum we're talking about is Russia essentially attempting to solidify their hold on Kherson by organizing a referendum, which would be largely ignored by the international community, of course, as a sham election, but in order to say we now own this territory because those who live in Kherson voted to have us as their leaders instead of the Ukrainians.
That's true. And they're Russifying it, having the ruble being used, offering passports and stuff. So the timing, what do you think about that, about this happening now?
I would suggest that's a secondary concern, though an important one. They did that, of course, in Crimea, a much sort of grander scale, way back in 2015. They got the result they want, annexed it, and I think that would be their ultimate objective. I don't think they'll get that far. I think the Ukrainians, as I've said before, will retake Kherson. But one thing that's worth remembering as well is what the Ukrainians have said, and it almost goes without saying, is what they'd like to do is try and take Kherson without the kind of savage fight that went on for the towns in the east, any of them, Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. They don't want that to happen in Kherson. And it may well be that what they've been doing, well, certainly what they've been doing over the last couple of months is shaping the situation so that doesn't happen, because what they have succeeded in doing is essentially isolating what remains of the Russian garrison in Kherson, leaving them with a pretty bitter choice, which is surrender now, fight on and get starved and be captured, or fight on and be killed.
Do you think
Zelensky said only yesterday?
Do you think you are in a minority of military analysts that believes Ukraine can retake Kherson? Because even from what you said earlier, it did not make me, didn't convince me that Ukraine is in a position right now to retake the city. We were talking earlier about how if you want to recapture territory, you need significantly more firepower and manpower to overcome that barrier than if you were defending a city. And as you said, Ukraine is down on personnel. It is down on the kind of weapons that perhaps would be needed to mount an assault like that. The weapons that they have are perhaps better for intimidating Russia, but not for actually taking over territory.
Yeah, I think that's a an excellent point, and I don't know if they'll retake Kherson. What I do know is that they've shaped the operational situation to present dilemmas to the Russian garrison that are very, very difficult for the Russian garrison to resolve to their benefit. And I suspect what will happen ultimately is if the Russian forces get as far as the outskirts of Kherson, which they will over the next few weeks, barring incident or accident or freak defeats, I think they will. Whether they go further into the city is another matter. I think they will invest the city and wait out. Now, let's not forget that the only link that the Russian garrison, however big it is, in Kherson has with its rather depleted supply train, because of the Ukrainian strikes over the last few weeks, not only their ammunition supplies are seriously reduced, also their food and other logistics. The only link they have is a pontoon bridge and some ferries. I wouldn't want to be volunteering to be on those over the next few weeks. So I think they're going to present dilemmas to the Russian garrison that would be very difficult to resolve. And I think we might end up with a besieged city. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to go in for the reasons I've suggested. They don't want to destroy the city. Of course, the Russians have a say in that as well. We'll see what happens. But I think that they've shaped the situation to invest the city in due course and force a capitulation. And I would expect them to do that, but it's not going to be quick.
We have a couple more questions. The community is very much interested in Kherson, and I'm going to put two of them together because they are very close. So first, World Peace, hello World Peace, says, I don't understand how capturing Kherson will mitigate the problems of a prolonged war. And Kevin Jensen says, when Ukraine takes back Kherson and the West Bank of Dnipro, where do you think the next offensive will be directed?
Great questions. I think you have to look at the grand strategic level for this, because Ukraine needs to present some form of success to the West.
Right.
It's got real strategic problems, and by that I mean the sort of political strategic level over the next 6 months, doesn't it? With huge pressure going to be applied on Western governments, particularly European governments, to cave in to Russian pressure, and highly understandably. So Ukraine wants to present some form of victory. Mm-hmm. So that's how it advances Ukraine's cause, and it's not a last throw of the dice. It's correctly timed, I think. They've got 2 or 3 months left, maybe just slightly less than that, 2 months of fighting season before the Rasputin sets in, which will slow things down considerably. Okay, so for the next part of that, where would be the next focus? I would expect that to be not in Donbass, but towards, south of Zaporizhzhia. Ukrainian forces are quite thinly spread as well, let's not forget. They have transferred a lot of their forces into that Kherson area. Mm-hmm. But just south there, you see Zaporizhzhia city. If you just take that due south, by the way, that blue checked area are areas which are assessed just in the red zone there, the blue checked area. Those are assessed to be areas of heavy partisan activity. But anyway, down there, a strike towards there would worry the Russians intensely, because it would threaten the link between Luhansk and Donetsk into Crimea over land. And I would think that would be the kind of thing that Ukraine would be looking at, but not this year.
Piggybacking off of what World Peace said about a prolonged war, I was watching a newscast earlier, and I heard an analyst say that this prolonged, protracted war could be 20, 30, 40 years. Do you think that that's possible? And if so, how would that be? He described it as not being a war anymore, but a struggle. Do you think that that's possible?
My crystal ball's broken, but I see his point. I was talking to an expert, really tip-top expert on conflict, just before I went out to Ukraine in May, and he said, "Look, what we're going to get here is a frozen conflict. It'll be something like Palestine, or perhaps in Israel." Or perhaps just a very, very big version of what they had over the last 8 years in Donetsk and Luhansk, or Donbass, or the Joint Forces operation, depending on who you talk to. But that is a real risk, I think, for Ukraine. Because if you look at Putin's original objective, which was, this rhetoric about denazification and all the rest of it, essentially what he wanted to do was remove or damage Ukraine as a going concern, as a civilized and viable state. And now with the south coast occupied, you have what amounts to a rump state, or a potential rump state, with a large army, angry people, and a government which looks pretty stable now, but after 2 or 3 years of this may not be. And that suits Putin's purposes very, very well. And that's why people like me have been arguing that what's required here over the next year, this isn't going to be quick, is a strategic decision on the part of the West that there needs to be a really effective and damaging blow against Russian forces delivered by Ukrainian forces to end this thing. Or it could go on for 5 years or 10 years or even more as a frozen conflict with essentially a very large failed state in the middle of Europe. And Europe has to avoid that at all costs. And that those costs are beginning to become very clear. But the alternative is a failed state in the centre of Europe.
Wow.
I was going to ask Nick if you can just talk about what the morale is in Ukraine right now in terms of support from the West. I know that at the very beginning there was some doubt that they would get the weapons deliveries that they wanted. Recently there has been some success of getting those weapons delivered, and then also to the front lines, which was another major challenge. But is there a sense there that they're looking at a winter of waning interest from the West and the Western media?
I think definitely the fear is there, not just in terms of the Western media, but also Western publics. And as Frank mentioned, given the issues around energy supplies and rocketing costs of living for ordinary voters across Western Europe, whether that willingness to kind of pay this price for conflict with Russia is going to stay. I think it's all quite short term. So you will have a report about Germany's defense minister, for instance, has in the past said that she doesn't want to basically give too much away of the kind of supplies that are currently sitting in the Bundeswehr's stockpiles. And every time a kind of quote like this comes out, you have a kind of wave of frustration on social media in Ukraine. People saying that they don't care about us. They just want to get back to business as usual with Russia. Then when a couple of weeks later some kit finally arrives, you have the opposite. I think people are just in a very nervous, very tired state after 6 months. Everyone's been glued to their phones for 6 months. Everyone's looking at every kind of headline that comes on their Telegram feed, and people often overreact. But I think definitely they are very wary of Ukraine and their situation falling off the agenda. I thought the thing that Frank said that was interesting about creating a failed state, that has been the wider pattern that Russia has used all along its borders to try and stop its former satellites, the former kind of Soviet satellites, from integrating with the West. You saw it in Georgia, where they have Abkhazia, they have South Ossetia, same with Moldova, with Transnistria, trying to create these permanent problems that basically mean that these former Soviet republics are so caught up with surviving and are so caught up with dealing with these entities or with these permanent kind of security issues that they're not politically in a state to get on with reforms and developing in a way that would see them leave Russia's sphere of influence. So that's definitely kind of the fear among many people in Ukraine. And the kind of ironic thing was that in the years running up to this war, Ukraine was actually doing really well economically. People's incomes had finally recovered from 2014, from that war in Donbass and the annexation of Crimea. And they finally, people were changing jobs, were going on holidays, were buying apartments, taking mortgages. Yeah. They finally thought that they were living in a normal country again, and then this happened. And I think there is a real fear among the kind of elites in Ukraine that basically people who have options, people who work in IT, who have skills that are valuable abroad, doctors, that if they're maybe in their 30s, 40s, they're just going to say, I'm not going to hang around. I can't wait for this country to be safe for my kids, for my job. Right. I'm just going to get on a plane and go be a doctor somewhere else.
So big brain drain.
That is definitely, already Ukraine has millions of people working abroad. Actually, remittances, money sent home by Ukrainians abroad is one of the main exports of Ukraine, as it were. It is incredibly important for keeping lots of rural communities particularly alive. And that is a real fear that if Ukraine just becomes a sinking ship or something that doesn't look like a good prospect to lots of people with options, that people might not want to basically sacrifice their youth, the kind of best years of their lives to kind of wait this out.
Looking back at the front line real quick, because there was a recent development that these weapons called HIMARS, this is a missile system, reached the front line. And a lot of analysts have said that this has changed the course of strategy, changed the course of the battles along the front lines in Ukraine. If we have a picture of this machine, this is something that Ukraine certainly didn't have at the beginning of the war, and a lot of people, like I said, are crediting it with turning the tide. I wonder if Frank could walk us through what this HIMAR is and why that's important to Ukraine.
High mobility artillery rocket system. It's the longest range ground-based weapon that the Ukrainians have, so it can strike out to about 80 kilometers. And a sort of signature strike of that was the airbase at Saki in Crimea just a couple of weeks ago. But much more important than that, actually, as that may have been a commando raid, nobody quite knows. But much more important than that are the consistent strikes on, and consistent and continuing strikes on Russian logistics and artillery ammunition bases. That makes creates real issues for, I think, and Nick's already mentioned this, for Russian artillery commanders. So there is that. Now, they've only got 16, according to the Americans, 16 units. That's, people are saying, I mean, artillery friends of mine, a friend of mine commanded an artillery regiment, he said, well, they'd be better off with 100, and of course they would. But the problem is that they can't absorb the training, the logistics chain, or indeed the huge quantities of ammunition and resources required right now for those numbers. But let's not forget, I mean, we mustn't obsess with one weapon system.
Right.
HIMARS is really important. No two ways about it. It gives you a precision capability at range. Not very long range, though. And one of the decisions to be made by the US, by the way, just over the next few weeks, I think, is whether they will give the Ukrainians something called ATACMS, which is a much longer range missile system, which could lead to strikes well into Russia's deep strategic rear, into Russia itself, probably. But I suspect we'll wait till after the midterms for that. But anyway, back to the point. There are also other weapon systems in that area which have been equally important. Precision artillery systems. Germany has given some of those. The UK has. Netherlands have, and of course the US in the shape of the M777 155mm artillery guns. Now, all of these take NATO ammunition. So the guys that Nick was talking to earlier, who were running out of Soviet 122mm ammunition, are now getting, probably now rearmed with, or should be rearmed, I would suspect, with, or will be rearmed with Western artillery systems. And the ammunition flow is far more secure for those. And what they do, they can offer, is really precise targeting, a bit like HIMARS, actually. Not quite the same range. You're looking at maybe a maximum 40 to 50 kilometers there, but really comfortably around 30. But those will will cut off the Russian supplies to the front lines. So they're not operational level. They don't cut in deep into the Russian rear. But what they offer you is the ability to deny Russia freedom of movement in its own immediate rear. So let's say the Ukrainians can take that right bank of the Dnieper. They can deploy their artillery systems, and they will cover 20 to 30, 40 miles, 40 to 50, 60 kilometers into the Russian rear alongside the HIMARS. So there are a whole constellation of new weapon systems that the Ukrainians are beginning to use very innovatively. And we haven't even started there on the drones, both the autonomous drones, the so-called suicide drones, which are much shorter range, the very short-range reconnaissance ones the British are beginning to give. We haven't spoken yet about the anti-ship missiles that deny much of the Black Sea to the Russian Navy. So all that together has produced a very formidable resistance to the Russians. All of those are Western weapons.
So we're going to have to wrap up here soon, but
Yeah,
we
let
want
me
to do some
the rapid fire with you and Nick. And basically, I'm going to pose you guys 2 questions, and you just take 30 seconds to kind of quickly answer them. Frank, you really got people intrigued about the idea of a failed state. And Harry J. Harrison, wants to know, how would a failed state affect the European Union?
Bosnia, back in the 90s, where I started my military career, such as it was a country of 4 million people. It became the nexus of a huge war and ruined the prospects for its entire population and everybody around it. Ukraine is 10 times bigger than that. It's right at the heart of Europe. It's one of the largest agrarian production and indeed high-tech production nodes in the world. It's heavily armed, and the prospect of that being ungoverned or poorly governed should give every European leader sleepless nights for the foreseeable future, which is why they have to start thinking very carefully about what they're going to do to avoid it.
Okay, Nick, following up on that, Spook Monkey, you guys have some crazy names. Wants to know why neighboring countries just don't go into Ukraine and support them. If Putin claimed more territory, he won't stop there.
Well, that's obviously the thing that kind of NATO countries have been really careful to avoid, that kind of contagion, making this a direct confrontation between NATO members and Russia. They'd be willing to send arms in. They're willing to train Ukrainian soldiers on their own territories. They're not training Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine. Anything to avoid being construed as kind of parties to this conflict. Because obviously in NATO, if, say, Slovakian or Polish troops in Ukraine got in some kind of confrontation with Russians, that then is NATO solidarity and would involve the whole rest of the bloc, in theory, having to come to their rescue. So that is the big fear, and something they've shied away from. We've interestingly seen the Russian kind of state media push loads of kind of variants saying that the Polish kind of government is keen to come in and send troops to Western Ukraine and basically come into parts of Ukraine that were once under Polish control before the Second World War. None of that has any kind of basis in fact for now, but certainly the Russian propaganda would like to posit this, would like to say this is a conflict not between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and all of NATO, all of the kind of collective West. And the reason we're not doing as well as we told you is because we've got America and the West fighting against us, not just those pesky Ukrainians.
I would like more time for rapid fire, but I think we need to pivot to Zaporizhzhia now, because we have a guest who's been waiting for us very patiently for a while.
Thank you, Elena Sokova.
But I just wanted to say thank you to Frank Ledwidge. You've been a guest on here before. We always appreciate your analysis. And thanks again for joining us.
It was great to have you, Frank. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And our audience loves you. And because we've been talking about the counteroffensive in the south, it's also important to talk about another big headline that's happening right now in Ukraine, but also affects the south and affects this area around Kherson. We've talked about how Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant, is a key strategic resource for Ukraine, but it's right now under the control of Russia. It's still actually providing electricity for parts of Ukraine, but it is under control of Russian troops who occupied it early on in the conflict, right, Dustin?
Yes. The power plant was actually controlled or taken over by Russian troops. We had a question about this earlier. I answered it in the chat. It was around the 3rd of March. That's when the fighting started, right before the power plant. But before, we have a story I did actually back then when the war started. Ukrainians living nearby the power plant were trying to block Russian access to it. I think we can pull up that clip. Possibly can pull up that clip.
I see it coming.
You see it coming? Wonderful. So basically, this is a bunch of Ukrainians trying to block access. And I feel like it just shows you guys a little bit how important that power plant is for this region, right? Like, people were really thinking, like, no, we don't want Russia to take this one power plant. But that's what happened.
This
at
is
the
just
end.
ordinary people, right? This isn't even soldiers.
This is just people living in the city next to the power plant. Obviously, a lot of them are employed in and around the plant. And they were just trying to do anything to prohibit from Russia from taking the plant, but it didn't work out. Russia took the plant after a day of fighting, and now it's Russian controlled.
When was that?
That was on the 3rd of March. So the fight was on the 3rd of March. This happened a couple of days before.
So fast forward a couple months later, and now we have a situation where this is the first war in a country that has nuclear power. It's unprecedented for a lot of security experts who have been worried about a situation like this. What threat does the fighting pose to this power plant? We've seen nuclear disasters before. Fukushima and Chernobyl are fresh in the minds of a lot of people, and of course, this is cause anxiety for the world, not just those who know a lot about nuclear power, but also those who just know about the historical accidents. But the IAEA, the International Association,
International
Atomic Energy Agency. Thank you. Acronyms are not my strong point. They are in Ukraine right now. There's a delegation of investigators who are hoping to visit the site after negotiating with Russia and Ukraine to make that possible. And we have a message from Grossi. If you could pull that up, we're getting that soon. But basically, they just took a kind of selfie.
I am just trying to find the pictures because there are actually pictures of Rafael Grossi, who's the head of the IAEA, meeting President Zelensky. But my computer is not playing ball. Hang on.
I like the group photo where the scientists look like, John Wayne.
Okay, Felix, we can take that now.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is President Zelensky meeting Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA. They arrived in Kiev earlier today.
Right, and this has been a long time in the planning. It's been over a month or more than a month of planning to try to get a delegation of investigators to go see what's actually happening at the plant, to assess the risks.
And this was pushed against earlier by the president because he felt like it would give credence to the Russian occupation. But now is pushing for this delegation, and so it's going to happen.
Right. We did have a tweet for you, but I think it's got lost in the shuffle. So we can just bring on Elena Sokova. She is going to talk us through this. She is a nuclear security expert. Is she with us? Great. She's from the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, the director there. So I just want to ask you, this delegation that has just arrived in Kiev, hoping to make their way to the power plant, what are they hoping to find there?
Well, I was listening very attentively to the conversation, fascinating discussions you had, and I may return to some of the points touched earlier.
Gladly.
But about the delegation from the International Atomic Energy Agency, that it's on its way to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Some of the things that they hope to do while they are there, and they should be able to, I assume if there are no kind of interference in their work. One is there have been a lot of reports about the damage to the site. And you need to remember that the nuclear power plant site has many buildings, many components to it. Not only the reactor itself, but also supporting system, the storage, nuclear fuel storage facilities, and others. So they really need to check what specifically has been damaged during the fighting in and around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The second point is many of the facilities there, but particularly the reactors themselves, have built-in safety features for various types of accidents. And it's very important to check whether they actually work and what kind of state of functioning they are. Because the Ukrainian regulator doesn't have access to the facility, and there's obviously not much trust in the statements that are made by the Russians in terms of everything is functioning and everything is well. So it's extremely important for them to have access to these systems and to check whether they are functioning properly. And another very important part of their mission is actually, it's already been mentioned that the power station itself, nuclear power plant, is under the Russian military control. But it is the Ukrainian personnel that continues to operate it. So, and obviously there have been reports, and it's not something that is questioned, is that they are under stress. They are working in the war zone. They don't have regular access to their families. Their families are nearby in the areas that are being shelled. And supposedly there is military at the facility. There were reports that they're working under the kind of presence of military, armed military. So it is a lot of stress. So you really need to assess what is the status of the personnel, because it relies a lot, the safety and security of nuclear facilities relies a lot on humans, on the personnel that operates them.
Just looking back at, I know you've said publicly too that you do not suspect that this would end up being a disaster on the scale of Chernobyl, but just looking at that accident, this is the worst nuclear accident in history. This was a problem of the personnel, right? So this was a mistake that was caused by the people who were working there, and that's what is so worrying, right, about the fact that these personnel are working under stress, because perhaps that is one of the biggest threats to the nuclear facility.
That is true. But there is a difference between the type of reactors and facilities that we had in Chernobyl, and that's the one that are at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And in addition to that, the international community learned a lot of lessons from the Chernobyl accident, and many of the features, automatic safety features, were built into the safety of the reactors. The biggest difference between Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, that the reactors there have a containment vessel. So basically, there is a structure that is 1 meter 20 centimeters thick, like a concrete reinforced structure, and also lined with a steel inside. So if there is some, first of all, it's very difficult to penetrate it. And like regular shelling, maybe a bunker buster bomb will damage it, but we're not talking about the use of these weapons so far in the war in Ukraine. Regular shelling is not likely to do the damage to the containment vessels. I'm not trying to say that they're completely safe. There could be still cracks, and if something goes wrong, the radioactive gases could escape and radioactivity. But probably the biggest issue is if we have to shut down them with the emergency, the reactors, and there is a cut in the water supply that cools the reactor. That could lead to something similar as Fukushima. And we're comparing Fukushima and Chernobyl. Obviously, Chernobyl is on a much higher scale of the impact.
A cut in water supply would be intentional, or are you talking about an accidental cut in water supply?
It could be both. It could be intentional. It could be accidental.
I'm just trying to understand how a cut in water supply would happen. Is that a very vulnerable part of the plant?
It is quite a vulnerable part of the plant, because if you don't have the electricity coming to the plant, and a couple of days ago there was a complete cutoff from the power grid. So in this situation, all the functioning, including the pumping of the water, relies on power generator, diesel power generator that are on the site. So they need to be fully functioning, and they need to have the supply of fuel to continue to pump water. of course, it's not going to happen immediately. We do have a window of some hours or so, but if it is not available, and it's not available for a long time, we could have a meltdown of the reactors.
Elena, we have a lot of questions for you in the chat. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to get them in so you could have time for them.
Sure.
Edward Solomons asks, what evidence is there that the Russians are using the plant as a military base, supply base, or fire base?
There is, from what I understand, there are many things that are happening around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that we cannot really verify. And there are accusations, as you know, both from the Ukrainian side and from the Russian side, that each other accusing of shelling. There are photographs, obviously, from satellite of some military vehicles at the power plant and the reactors. But it's been known that the Russian does have military personnel at the facility. But in terms of who is shelling at whom or firing, it's very kind of convoluted, fogged situation. There was a comment earlier in the program about that the IAEA will be able to tell who is doing that. No, they won't. And it's not their mission. They are very narrow. They have very narrow mandate. They're going to look at the safety, security, and another term, safeguards issues that are related to the nuclear power plant.
Okay.
So we shouldn't be conflating some of the, and obviously it would have been nice to learn some of these things, but I don't think we should expect that to come out of their mission.
And
Actually,
Duncan Stewart, let me just get this question out while we're still on it. Duncan Stewart says, could Russia actually release radiation? I think that this is on people's mind because in surrounding cities are handing out iodine tablets. So is that possible?
If the question is about whether Russia could do something deliberate
Yes.
to lead to the release of the radiation, well, first of all, they have their own military and personnel, and radiation doesn't recognize the word, this is a facility and I'm going to stay there.
Right.
So the radiation goes out. So I think it would be very irrational. But having said that, this entire war and having military operation around nuclear facility is irrational. But I don't think that would be the case. In addition, from what I understand, Russia wants to keep that power plant operational. In fact, it supplies that southern part of Ukraine that has been occupied with power. So that's very important as well, as you can imagine, particularly when winter is coming to that region.
Okay. Dustin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a small detail. I don't know if you could pull it up that fast. We do have the satellite picture of Russian military vehicles next to the power plant. And there's also a video that's going around that I wasn't able to verify before the show. That's why we are not showing it. But there is a video going around of trucks being parked inside what seems to be some kind of storage area that's close to the reactor. What people are saying is the video would have been taken by as someone who works at the plant and is Ukrainian and tried to smuggle it out. But yeah, I wasn't able to verify it. That's why we're not showing it. Do we have the satellite picture ready?
It's been up.
It's been up, yes.
Oh, it has been up already. Oh, okay, well then you guys have seen
friends.
it. I missed it. There was military vehicles. You could see underneath a walkway next to a reactor.
Okay, I see the. Those are the videos.
They're
see
in the
them?
shade, so they're just under the edge
They're
there.
like in the shadow.
And is that
almost.
the reactor with the red cap there?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of 6, right?
Exactly.
One of 6. Only 2 of them are currently operational. And in addition to that, they are operated in a much lower level than normally do. That is also probably partly
Sorry.
we have partly an attempt to minimize if there is a need to shut them down. It's easier to do it when they are not at the maximum operation level.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. I was just wondering how far radioactive material could spread if there was some kind of a meltdown there.
It really depends on what kind of damage there is. If the containment vessel works, then the radiation probably is most likely going to be spreading through the water, the underground water that could leak out and contaminate actually Dnipro River and leak into the Black Sea. So that's one of the scenarios. There are other scenarios. For example, there is also a storage of spent dry fuel on the site. If these storage containers are damaged and the fuel starts to leak, the gases, radioactive gases, start to leak, that is the likelihood of all these scenarios. Originally, they're going to be very local contamination. It is not. We're not again talking about the situation where the radioactive cloud's going to cover half of Europe. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, with the water contamination, it could go into downstream and get into the Black Sea and so forth. But it really depends on what kind of radioactive accident we're going to have, if we have one. So that there are different scenarios, but the worst scenario is, as I mentioned, is Fukushima type of accident.
Mm-hmm. So some in the West, like the United States, are pushing for preemptive powering down of nuclear reactors and demilitarizing the area. And one of our viewers, Edward Solomon, and I'm just losing his question. Oh, I have it back. He asked, would it be possible to make the plant a DMZ only if the plant comes under UN control to ensure that it would be demilitarized?
So far, what I've heard from the reactions from the Russian side, the deputy foreign minister, that they pushed back on the whole idea of demilitarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant area. I wouldn't exclude it totally, and I think if it is done under the UN and with some independent, neutral monitor, because it will require some military present in the area. So in this respect, if it is some independent or UN kind of forces providing that is probably, that's a much better idea than continue to have fight in and around the nuclear power plant. But I don't know how and whether Russia will accept that. As I said, the original response was negative to that. But Russia actually itself said that if the shelling continues, they will likely shut down all the reactors. They haven't done it so far, and as mentioned, it provides power to both to the occupied southern part of Ukraine, but also to Ukraine itself, to the remaining northern and eastern territories, and western territories. So far it has been operational. I guess it didn't reach that point where the Russians considered that this is probably the best solution, just to shut it down. But I would also wait for the results from the IAEA mission there and the assessment. Maybe there is a recommendation that comes out that maybe it's better to shut them down and not to prevent any of the further any possibility of radiological accident.
But that's what makes this situation so wild, right? That it's in the middle of a war zone. So despite the recommendations of experts, Russia or Ukraine, for that matter, could say, we don't want to abide by those instructions. We don't take your advice seriously because we have other objectives, right? I mean, in other words, my question is, what is a realistic way to protect this nuclear facility from an accident that would that both sides could agree to?
We are in an unusual situation. We keep highlighting it. The international community never had a similar situation where I have to deal with the safety and security of operational nuclear power plants in the middle of the war conflict. We are still, in the international community, still searching for possible solution. So one of them that emerged relatively recently is that establishing a demilitarized zone around the nuclear power plant. There are suggestions for, say, even the IAEA to have some presence there on a continuing basis to monitor it. Mm-hmm. But it may well come down to the point where it's like all the options and suggestions have been exhausted. And the best way to avoid potential accident is to shut them down. So we don't know, but it is, keep highlighting, it's a very unusual situation where we never thought that we'd have to deal with something like that. And the international community have not had a precedent or thought through what to do in this situation. We are coming up with solutions and suggestions how to handle it as the conflict unfolds.
Well, Elena Sokova, Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, you're the director there. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate you staying on with us and joining our conversation. We have to wrap up now, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Elena.
But
thank you.
And we're glad that you had a chance to answer our audience questions, too. It's always great to have those questions go directly to an expert like you in the field.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Say goodbye to your cat for me. We met her cat earlier.
We met her cat earlier.
Yeah, no one's going to know what that is.
I had to kick them out.
Oh, yes, okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, and hope to see you another time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And we have the poll results.
That's right.
Are you ready? Are you going to tell me your answer now, or are you going to wait until I give all the results?
Yeah, I mean...
Why are you being stingy with your opinion?
I have to admit that I was part of creating this poll. It was, well, let me just say it was my idea. But I also agree with everybody in the chat who was like, what the heck, this is not fair. I can't pick one of these. I would say, obviously, for me, the most important thing as a human being is that there's a just outcome of this war. I hate to see the suffering. I hate to see this war continue in such a way that we see deaths that are completely unjustifiable. War is a horrible thing, and that's what worries me the most, and that's why I follow the news. But as a journalist, obviously, I'm also just interested in how this happens politically, what decisions are made to influence the outcome, and who influences these decisions as well, how public opinion around the world. That's a long-winded way of saying this is a dumb poll.
You have a lot of thoughts on it.
No, it's a complex question, but we wanted to get the discussion started. That's
what the question is what is your primary reason for following events in Ukraine, and why, if you don't agree, pick one of these? And so the winner at 42% is, I am interested in military strategy. Which doesn't surprise me, because these guys seem to know all about the weapons and whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen.
I know HIMARS. That's
what we've seen when we've had somebody like Frank Ledwidge on, who I had earlier, who can really discuss these issues. It's something that we haven't seen for such a long time in Europe. A war like this, where you're really seeing a solid front line, troop movements. So I think that is... obviously an interest.
And it's great to have you here, Nick. I mean, in the last few minutes, is there something that you would want to share that you think people should know about this war, what's happening, and how it's affecting the people in Ukraine?
I mean, there's definitely one thing that we heard from Elena just now that really kind of caught my attention. I'd heard it kind of more indirectly without kind of being fleshed out about the biggest risk here not being necessarily a direct strike at that power station, but just the power going out for a couple of hours. Something as simple as that, not having enough diesel for the generators, that actually could lead to something much more dramatic than shelling and a direct hit, those reactors overheating. That is something that is just beyond scary, that basically apart from the kind of fighting, that just kind of some kind of miscalculation, some kind of chain of errors, some diesel not making its way there in time could actually cost a lot more human lives than something premeditated. That is beyond scary, and something that I think we should be talking on about every time we think about Ukraine, because I think the space for mistakes and for kind of tragic mistakes is huge in this conflict. For now, we don't really have good numbers on how many civilians have died. There are different numbers kind of doing the rounds there. But I think this is a conflict that is going to see more civilian deaths, unfortunately, in the months to come. Yes, the fighting is kind of localized, but there are still hundreds of thousands of people living, very, very close to those front lines, be it in Mykolaiv. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city, is only about 30, 40 kilometers from the Russian border and is constantly being shelled. I saw pictures recently of city streets that I'd walked down a couple of months ago where it seemed like Kharkiv was kind of out of the line of fire, and now basically downtown is being shelled every day. This is a very scary situation, and one that, as we've talked about, Ukrainians are really desperate and really concerned that people out there are going to keep on paying attention and keep on listening to their stories and not get bored and not just zone out.
I'd like to widen the conversation just right at the very end. I know that we don't have that much time, but I do think it's something that we haven't touched on very much yet. And we're talking about this push in the south, Ukraine announcing a counteroffensive against Russian forces. We've heard from our military analyst, Frank Ledwidge, earlier that it's going to move slowly, if at all, that Ukraine has reduced capabilities because of the loss of manpower, because of the difficulty of pushing back against Russian gains. Russia has really locked in a lot of areas in the east and the south, which is what is in question right now. So we're talking about a long war of attrition. We're talking about a conflict that's going to be prolonged much further than Russia had anticipated at the beginning, but also much further than a lot of commentators had perhaps hoped for in the first couple of weeks and months of the war. So we're talking about the daily loss of life. We're talking about a situation that isn't moving very much despite these big announcements from the Ukrainian government. So I'm wondering, you're a journalist. I don't want you to tell me exactly what you want to happen, but maybe if we can just talk about what is this discussion right now as Ukraine pushes back against Russian front lines about making a decision about when to negotiate a peace. Because of the daily loss of life, as I said, Ukraine, even military analysts saying, has little chance of pushing the front lines very much in the next year, I think Frank had said earlier. So what are the arguments on both sides of that Ukraine should negotiate now while it still has the territory it has?
I mean, there's definitely, in Ukraine, there's no big debate on this, actually. There are basically no voices saying we should basically legitimize what Russia has done and kind of cut a deal. That is just beyond the pale in terms of the Ukrainian debate right now. Even if most people in Ukraine understand that maybe they're not going to be in Donetsk or Luhansk, or even somewhere much closer like Berdyansk within the next months or years, there is just no political will to basically let Russia off the hook and allow them to basically kind of freeze this into a kind of eternal conflict. Obviously, there are arguments to be made in terms of allowing, the people in Ukrainian-controlled territory to live without the threat of Russian attacks in the short term. But the thing is, people in Ukraine don't believe that any deal is going to hold. They are convinced that Vladimir Putin wants to destroy their country, that he just needs a break now. He needs some time to gather resources in terms of manpower, in terms of equipment to carry on taking another bite at the apple, as it were. So there's no real belief that, it's the opposite, that if you were to give Russia some kind of break now, it would make it easier for Russia in the future then to come back once it's kind of done its homework and repaired all the damage done and kind of improved the failings of Russia's army that we've seen over the past few months, that actually that would give Russia more of a chance to take even more of Ukraine. And I think Kiev, as lots of Western intelligence services still think, seems to be still a very real, at least for the Russian security services, at the top of their list of targets. They are not willing to give up the idea of basically doing away with Ukraine as an independent entity. So I think the idea that somehow you could kind of end this conflict permanently by signing some kind of deal, I think that just doesn't make sense to most people in Ukraine.
So you're talking about appeasement and saying, no, if we give this area, then Putin will try to take that area.
Exactly. There is a sense that Ukraine as an independent entity is just something that Russia, with its current leadership, doesn't want to tolerate, and that it's just a question of giving the Russians more time to rally their forces and then to kind of start again. I think there isn't. Maybe you remember those kind of extraordinary speeches that Putin gave in the days leading up to the war, often kind of broadcast late night. He visibly angry, feeling aggrieved that the West had, as he said, treated him and Russia badly, and talking about the history, talking about the fact that Ukraine was basically a made-up country, that it was an anti-Russia that had been basically supported by the West to weaken Russia. So, how do you go back from that? How do you row back from that and say, oh no, we're going to do a deal and we're going to have good neighborly relations. We'll just take what we've currently occupied and then just kind of go back to business as usual. I think that's just not an option for most Ukrainians. They just don't have that trust that Russia is going to leave them alone if they leave things as it is.
I have one more question for you from Tobias Nikonia. He says, will Ukraine be able to retake Kherson?
I mean, I think that's a question more for Frank. I also am kind of short on crystal balls, but it does seem like they have done their homework. They have really spent the last couple of weeks destroying those Russian logistics around there, and it is really difficult, as we said several times already. How are those Russian troops going to fight if they have no access to kind of their rear to their supplies, if they're having to rely on pontoon bridges that are getting blown up, if they're having to rely on ferries across this big river, which gives the Ukrainians a lot of time to attack these shipments because this is going to take a lot of time to get those supplies in. So I think Ukraine does have a chance of getting a kind of medium-sized win here, pushing the Russians back from that right-hand bank of the Dnipro River. But obviously that's something we're going to have to follow and in the next few weeks see if these big announcements actually turn into facts on the ground.
Dustin, you had a...
Yes, I have one last user question we can answer from before. It was kind of overlooked before. Or just we moved on from
and our
Frank.
fact checker picked it up.
Yes, I saw it. It's about budgets. So someone asked Ricky Ricardo asked, how is it possible for the Russians with a budget of only 65 billion for the military to hold up for such a long time? What Ricardo means here, I think obviously 65 billion sounds like a big number, but it is relatively small in comparison to other countries. Basically my short answer to this is it's all about purchasing power. 65 billion in local in rubles is just different kind of purchasing power because prices are different and you get different things for the money you invest. So if you actually there are comparisons out there, if you Google them, I'm sure you can find them, Ricardo. Purchasing power, if you that's what you need to Google. If you put that into account, the budgets are way closer together.
But also, there's, I think, lots of spending in Russia that is secret, and we just don't know how much is actually flowing there. So I think there's potential for actually a lot more in the way of money flowing towards the military. And now, obviously, with these crazy energy prices we're seeing, there's no shortage of cash in terms of, in the short term at least, for the Russian government to try and buy things. The other question, though, is where are they going to get tech, where are they going to get supplies with the sanctions right now? At the beginning of the war, lots of Ukrainian bloggers were going through bits of Russian missiles that had been found kind of blown up on the battlefield, and they were going through the parts and kind of analysing where the bits came from. And there were chips from Western European countries, from Taiwan, from Japan, from South Korea, countries that are now all severely limiting what they sell to Russia. So the question is, even with all the money in the world, will Russia be able to actually kind of rebuild that arsenal?
Right. Wow. It's not the cash that they're lacking, but the thing that the cash should buy them. Right. So we have been trying to attempt to answer that question. could Ukraine possibly take back Kherson? Could it take back the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia? Is it able to push back Russia from the front line in the south? We're talking about this because the Ukrainian government announced a major push in the south, the long-awaited counteroffensive there. Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I just want to thank everybody for joining us, for sending some pretty awesome questions to us, to our guests on the show as well. This is our final episode for a while anyway, but we always want your feedback. DW News is not going anywhere. We still have our YouTube channel where you will probably see Nick in the next few weeks. You're going back to Ukraine?
I'm going back on Sundays.
On Sundays, so he'll be reporting from there.
Stay safe.
Yeah, honestly. And I want to thank you guys for all of your amazing questions and for your comments, helping with the flow and keeping things going. I learned from you guys, too, just as much as I learned from the experts, so it's great. And it was great having you for 8 episodes, and this is the final one. So thank you, guys.
Let us know what you think. And like I said, DW News on YouTube, if you just search that, we have a live stream 24/7 with breaking news, with headlines. You'll see Nick, you'll see myself, you'll see Stacy. All of us are there, so we're not going anywhere.
And if you really want to keep tabbed in and being able to talk to hosts, you should check out our Twitch channel. It's called DW News Hangout, and this is, what did you call it, Hannah? Our little sibling?
I said they were a sister project or a little brother project. Who knows?
Yeah. So check it out on Wednesdays and Fridays.
That's right. So, signing off, DW News Desk. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you. That was a